Powder River Flats, Wyoming, September 1903. The autumn sun was a weak coin in a washed-out sky, offering little promise against the wind that scoured the plains. It was a wind that carried the first hint of teeth, a dry mineral cold that spoke of what was to come. On a small plot of land miles from the nearest town, Arturs Leapinch was building his folly. That's what they called it. His folly, his madness, his Latvian icebox. Delmar Crutchfield, a sheep camp carpenter with knuckles like walnuts and a face tanned to the color of old leather, spat a stream of tobacco juice that the wind snatched and atomized. He stood with two other ranchers, Silas Cobb and Jebediah Stone, watching Arturs and his young son Janus wrestle another curved sheet of corrugated steel into place. "Look at him," Crutchfield said, his voice a low rumble of certainty. "Puts up a perfectly good 26-foot Quonset, and what does he do? He starts building another one right inside it. A damn Russian doll of a house." Arturs was methodical, his movements economical. He was erecting the ribs for an 18-foot Quonset hut, perfectly centered within the larger shell they had just finished. A measured gap of 14 inches separated the two structures. To the men watching, it was a waste of material, a waste of space, and a profound display of ignorance about the realities of a Wyoming winter. "That gap's where the trouble will live, Delmar," Silas Cobb offered, pulling his hat down. "Come January, that space will be nothing but a chimney for the cold." "Worse," Crutchfield corrected, asserting his authority as a man who had built dozens of shelters against this very sky. "It's two walls of sweating steel. You know what happens when you get a warm fire on one side of a steel sheet and 30 below on the other. It weeps. It drips. He's building himself a cave of ice. He'll have icicles hanging from his ceiling by Christmas. Mark my words. The man's foolish." Arturs heard the murmurs, the low laughter that drifted on the wind. He set a rivet, handed the hammer to his son, and wiped a trickle of sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. He looked over at the men, his gaze calm and unreadable. He offered no argument, no defense. He simply picked up the next steel panel. The mockery lasted for the rest of the afternoon. The validation would have to wait for the killing cold. What did this Latvian smokehouse builder, a man who knew more about curing meat than framing a house, understand about the physics of dead air insulation that a seasoned sheep camp carpenter and a lifetime of frontier experience had missed? The answer to that question would rewrite the rules of survival on the high plains. It would be an education delivered not by books or lectures, but by 72 hours of a howling ground blizzard and the undeniable proof of a single, dry sheet of paper. If you stick with us, I promise you will learn the fundamental principle that makes every modern thermos, insulated window, and structural panel work. It's a secret hidden not in what you build, but in the empty space you build around. Let us know in the comments, what's the coldest winter you've ever personally experienced? We value your time and your curiosity. Subscribing to this channel ensures you won't miss these stories of forgotten ingenuity, where ordinary people solved extraordinary problems with nothing but their hands and a deep understanding of the world. Arturs Leapinch was not a carpenter. He was not a rancher, nor was he a frontiersman in the way his neighbors understood the term. He was a man shaped by the damp, cold forests of the Baltic coast, a place where winter had a different character. It was a wet, penetrating cold, a season of slow curing meats, and the constant battle against rot and moisture. His hands were trained not on framing saws and log chisels, but on the precise construction of brick kilns, curing sheds, and smokehouses. He understood the behavior of heat and moisture not as an abstraction, but as a tangible force that could preserve or destroy a family's winter provisions. The objects of his trade were fire brick, mortar, heavy oak doors with felt seals, and carefully layered walls designed to hold a steady, low warmth for weeks on end. He had arrived in Wyoming with his wife, Elza, and their two children, Janice and Laga, 2 years prior, lured by railroad posters promising fertile land under a wide-open sky. The land was wide open, but its fertility was a cruel joke. The first winter, 1902, had nearly broken them. They lived in a standard-issue homesteader's shack, a single-walled affair of green pine that shrank as it dried, opening 100 tiny cracks for the wind to knife through. That winter became a series of bitter sensory memories. Arturs remembered the bacon rind, frozen so solid in the pantry that it snapped like glass when Elza tried to slice it. He remembered the small, delicate silver filigree of frost that coated the inside of the lamp chimneys by dawn, a beautiful and terrifying sign of how much cold had invaded their tiny space. He remembered the coffee, poured scalding from the pot into his mug, developing a skin of cool brown within a minute, the heat sucked out of it by the frigid air. They burned through their woodpile by February, and Arturs spent desperate, freezing days gathering sagebrush and buffalo chips to feed the stove, a meager fuel that provided more smoke than warmth. The children were always cold. Elza's hands were cracked and raw. It was a winter of shivering endurance, a lesson in failure. Arturs vowed it would be the last. The problem, as he saw it, wasn't just the cold outside, it was the profound inefficiency of the structures meant to repel it. The Quonset hut, a recent innovation appearing on the plains, was touted as a modern solution, strong, cheap, and fast to erect. But Arturs saw the same fundamental flaw as in his wooden shack, only magnified. Steel was a conductor, an astonishingly good one. Leaning against the single steel wall of a neighbor's hut that winter, he had felt the warmth being pulled directly from his body into the frozen world. It was a thermal hemorrhage. A house made of a single sheet of steel in Wyoming was not a shelter. It was a machine for getting cold. His neighbors fought this inefficiency with fuel. They ran their stoves red hot, burning through cords of precious cottonwood and pine. A constant roaring plume of smoke and wasted heat billowed from their stovepipes, a visible sign of their struggle. Inside, the battle was just as plain. The superheated air from the stove would rise, hit the freezing steel ceiling, and its moisture would instantly condense and freeze. A fine layer of frost, what the old-timers called frost flowers, would grow along every rib and rivet. On warmer days, or when the stove was particularly hot, this frost would melt and drip, a miserable indoor rain that soaked bedding and spirits alike. The conventional wisdom was to build thicker, insulate with sod or tar paper, and stockpile more wood. Arturs knew that was a losing fight. You couldn't defeat the physics of conduction with brute force. You had to trick it. In Latvia, to build a smokehouse that held a perfect, even temperature, you didn't just build one thick wall. You built two thin walls with a space between them. The real insulation wasn't the brick or the wood. It was the trapped, unmoving air in the cavity. Air, if held perfectly still, is one of the most effective insulators in nature. It doesn't conduct heat well. The trick was to stop it from moving, to prevent the cycle of convection, where warm air rises and cool air sinks, transferring heat in the process. He would not build a thicker wall, he would build a wall of nothing. The construction of the double Quonset was an act of quiet defiance. He ordered the components for both the 26-foot and 18-foot huts from the Sears, Roebuck catalog, a significant investment that drew clucks of disapproval from his neighbors at the general store. The larger shell went up first, a standard procedure. He and Janice, now 12 and strong for his age, bolted the corrugated arches to the wooden foundation. It looked like any other Quonset on the plains. Then the strange work began. Inside the cavernous space, they began assembling the smaller hut. It was a painstaking process. Each rib of the inner shell had to be perfectly aligned with its larger counterpart. They used wooden jigs Arters had fashioned to maintain a precise 14-inch gap on all sides. This wasn't just a small room built inside a big one. It was a complete, structurally independent building nested within another, sharing only the ground it stood on. Elsa, watching from the doorway of their old shack, felt a familiar mix of trust and quiet concern. "It looks like a drum, Arters," she said one evening, her voice soft. "A big silver drum?" He nodded, tapping one of the inner ribs. It rang with a dull thud, the sound absorbed by the surrounding air. A drum holds sound. This will hold warmth. It was during this phase that Delmar Crutchfield made his most forceful objection. He'd come over ostensibly to borrow a wrench, but his real purpose was to pass judgment. He walked into the structure, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He ran a hand over the inner steel sheet, then the outer one. He paced the 14-inch gap. "Leap inch," he began, using the formal tone of a man delivering a difficult but necessary truth. "I've built 50 sheep camps from here to the Bighorns. I know what steel does in the cold. You've got a warm, moist room here." He gestured to the inner space. "And a freezing cold wall here." He slapped the outer shell. "The moisture from your breathing, your cooking, your living, is going to pass right through that inner tin wall. When it hits that outer wall, which will be 30 below zero, it's going to turn to a solid sheet of ice. You're building a sweat box, a damned ice machine. By January, it'll be raining in here. Raining ice. You're sealing your own misery in with you." Arters listened patiently, his head tilted. He respected Crutchfield's experience. The man's logic was sound, based on everything he had ever seen. But his experience was limited to single-wall systems, where the moisture had a freezing surface to condense upon. When Crutchfield was finished, Arters simply said, "The air must be still, and it must be sealed." He pointed to the top and bottom of the cavity, where he was meticulously applying pine tar and felt stripping to every seam. No air gets in, no air gets out. Crutchfield just shook his head and walked away, the wrench forgotten. He had tried to warn the fool. Now nature would have to teach the lesson. The man and his family would be living in a dripping, frozen tomb of his own strange design. To understand why Arters was so confident and Crutchfield was so wrong, you have to understand the 3 ways heat moves: conduction, convection, and radiation. For a homesteader in a Quonset hut, conduction was the great enemy. Conduction is heat transfer through direct contact. A steel wall is a solid object. When you heat one side, the molecules vibrate faster, bumping into their neighbors and passing that energy along until it reaches the cold side. Steel is a fantastic conductor. A single steel wall is a superhighway for heat, allowing precious BTUs, the basic unit of heat energy, to escape your home at an incredible rate. To stay warm, you have to generate heat faster than the wall can conduct it away. This is why his neighbors' stoves ran constantly. Crutchfield's prediction about condensation was based on this principle. He knew the inner surface of his own single-wall hut would be nearly as cold as the outside air, providing a perfect place for the moisture in the warm interior air to condense and freeze. He saw Arters' design as 2 of these surfaces, doubling the problem. What he missed was the gap. A 14-inch cavity filled with air is not a solid. Air, particularly dry, still air, is a terrible conductor of heat. Its molecules are spaced far apart. For heat to conduct across the gap, it would have to pass from the inner steel wall to an air molecule, which would then have to drift across and bump into the outer wall. This is a vastly less efficient process than the direct molecular transfer through solid steel. Arters was replacing a heat superhighway with a winding, bumpy dirt track. But what about convection? This is heat transfer through the movement of fluids, like air. Warm air rises, cool air sinks. If the air in the cavity were allowed to circulate, the air warmed by the inner shell would rise, travel to the top, touch the cold outer shell, cool off, sink, and be replaced by more warm air from below. This convective loop would create a conveyor belt, constantly carrying heat from the inner wall to the outer wall. This is why Arter's most meticulous work was in sealing the cavity. By creating a truly sealed, or dead, airspace, he was stopping convection before it could start. The air was trapped. It couldn't form a loop. It just sat there, a thick, invisible blanket of poor conductivity. The heat from his living space would warm the inner steel shell, but that shell's ability to pass heat into the dead airspace was minimal. The outer shell would remain almost as cold as the ambient air outside, completely disconnected from the thermal environment inside. Crutchfield saw two walls. Arter saw one warm room, one cold shell, and a 14-inch buffer of immobile calm that separated the two worlds. He wasn't building a wall of steel. He was building a wall of air. The first snows came in November, light dustings that melted by noon. By mid-December, the ground was frozen solid and a permanent layer of white covered the plains. The cold was a constant presence, a pressure on the landscape. Inside the standard Quonsets of Delmar Crutchfield and Jebediah Stone, the winter routine began. The stoves were never allowed to go out. A box of firewood sat beside them, constantly being fed. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of hot metal. At night, the temperature would drop 20 degrees away from the stove. Water buckets froze solid. Bedding near the walls grew damp and cold. The frost flowers bloomed on the steel ribs. A beautiful, deadly garden of ice. Inside the Leapinch home, it was quiet. Their stove was a small, efficient cast-iron model, and it was rarely more than half full. Arter's would load it in the morning and again in the evening. For most of the day, it ticked over with a low fire, consuming a fraction of the wood his neighbors burned. The temperature was a steady 68 degrees throughout the entire inner dome. There were no cold spots, no drafts. The domestic rhythm of their lives was transformed. The previous winter, every activity was dictated by the cold. This year, life was simply normal. Elsa found she could leave butter out on the kitchen table, and it would remain soft. She rolled out the dough for pierogi, the small, savory pastries of her homeland, on a large wooden board. The dough, sensitive to chill, remained pliable and easy to work, something that would have been impossible in their old shack, where it would have stiffened in minutes. Young Laga would sit on the floor, far from the stove, playing with her dolls, her cheeks rosy with warmth, not feverish cold. And on the wall, a simple paper calendar from the general store hung perfectly flat and dry against the inner steel shell, an unassuming testament to the impossible reality of the house. Then, in the third week of January, the sky turned a strange, bruised yellow to the northwest. The wind died completely, an eerie silence falling over the plains. The old-timers knew the sign. A ground blizzard was coming. Arter's brought in the last of the livestock, checked the seals on his outer shell, and laid in enough wood for a week. For 7 days, the world disappeared. The wind didn't just blow. It was a solid, moving force, a horizontal river of frozen grit that erased the horizon. It picked up the loose snow from the plains and hurled it with such force that it sounded like sand scouring the steel shell. The temperature plummeted to 30 degrees below zero, a cold so profound it felt like it could crack bone. Visibility was less than 10 feet. To be caught outside was a death sentence. In his camp a few miles away, Delmar Crutchfield was fighting a desperate battle. The wind found every tiny seam in his hut, driving needle-sharp drafts into the room. He and his 2 hired hands huddled around the stove, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The steel walls groaned under the force of the wind, and the inside was coated in a thick, shimmering layer of ice. Twice, the stovepipe, caked in wind-driven snow, clogged and filled the hut with choking smoke, until one of them risked a desperate, frost-bitten scramble to the roof to clear it. They were surviving, but only just. In the Leapinge home, the storm was a distant drumbeat on the outer shell. The wind was a muffled roar, a sound from another world. Inside the inner shell, the air was still. The small stove burned its quiet fire. The lamp cast a steady, golden glow. Janice read a book. Elsa mended a shirt. Laga slept soundly in her bed. Arturs would occasionally walk the perimeter of the inner room, placing his bare palm against the steel wall. It was cool, but not cold. It felt like the wall of a cellar in summer, not a sheet of metal with a 30-below blizzard on the other side. He would nod to himself. The quiet space was holding. On the 8th day, the wind stopped. The silence that followed was as shocking as the noise had been. The sun rose on a world transformed, a landscape of sculpted white drifts, pure and blinding. Delmar Crutchfield, his face raw with windburn, emerged from his hut. His first priority was the lambing sheds. He feared the worst. He began the arduous task of digging his way out, his muscles aching with cold and exhaustion. His path took him past Arturs Leapinge's property. From a distance, the double Quonset looked like any other, half buried in a massive drift. But as Crutchfield got closer, he noticed something strange. The snow was packed hard right up against the corrugated steel of the outer shell. It wasn't melted at all. On his own hut and every other he had ever seen, there was always a gap, an indentation near the base, where the heat escaping from the walls had melted the surrounding snow. Leapinge's hut showed no such melt. It was as if the building itself were as cold as the snow packed against it. Crutchfield stopped, leaning on his shovel, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He looked up. The stovepipe extending from the peak of the roof was almost perfectly clean, scoured by the wind. But it wasn't the pipe that held his attention. It was what was coming out of it. Or rather, what wasn't. From his own stovepipe and every other occupied shelter on the plains, a thick, white column of smoke and hot air would be pouring out, a frantic signal of the fire burning within. From Arturs's pipe, there was almost nothing. Just a faint, transparent shimmer, a slight distortion in the air, the kind you see above hot asphalt in the summer. It was the exhaust of a fire barely trying. The implications hit Delmar Crutchfield with the force of a physical blow. No melted snow at the base, no plume of wasted heat from the chimney. The heat wasn't escaping. It was staying inside. He didn't know if he was angry or awestruck. He left his path to the lambing sheds and trudged through the deep snow to the strange structure. He had to see. He had to know. Arturs was outside, clearing a path, his movements unhurried. He saw Crutchfield approach and simply nodded. "Leapinge," Crutchfield said, his voice hoarse. "Your family, they are all right?" "We are fine," Arturs said. "A long storm." I need to see inside," Crutchfield said. It was not a request. It was a plea for understanding. Arturs led him to the door of the outer shell, then through the small enclosed vestibule to the door of the inner sanctum. He pushed it open. Crutchfield stepped inside, and the world shifted. The Vindication was not a sound, but a feeling. He had expected to walk from the biting 30-below cold into a damp, smoky, marginally less cold room, the air tasting of ice and desperation. He expected the familiar misery of a winter shelter. Instead, he was enveloped. It was a wave of calm, dry, steady warmth. There was no smoke in the air, no smell of damp wool. He instinctively took off his hat. His eyes, accustomed to the brutal glare of the snow, adjusted. He saw the children playing. He saw the soft butter on the table. But his builder's gaze went straight to the walls. He walked over and placed his bare, chapped hand on the inner steel. It was cool, but it didn't bite. It felt neutral, inert. He looked up at the curved ceiling, at the ribs and the rivets. They were clean, bare steel. There was not a single frost flower, not a bead of moisture, nothing. Then he saw it. The paper calendar, hanging from a small nail, its edges crisp, its surface perfectly flat. In his own hut, a piece of paper like that would be a damp, curled rag by now, frozen stiff. This simple, cheap object was the most undeniable proof of all. It was a declaration of victory over the laws of winter as he knew them. He turned to Arturs, who was watching him with that same quiet patience. Crutchfield's lifetime of certainty had evaporated in a single moment of warmth. He struggled for words, to give a name to what this man had accomplished. He looked at the gap between the inner door and the outer one, at the 14 inches of nothing that held this impossible comfort. "My God, Leapinch," Delmar Crutchfield said, his voice full of a reverence that bordered on fear. "You didn't build two walls. You built the quiet between them." The story of the Leapinch shell spread, as useful things do on the frontier, through practical demonstration. Crutchfield, once the loudest critic, became its most fervent advocate. He didn't just admit he was wrong, he adopted the design, building a double-shelled bunkhouse for his shearing crew that spring. The idea found its champion in an unlikely figure, a railroad livestock agent named Arthur Abernathy. Abernathy was a man of logistics, obsessed with efficiency, waste, and the brutal calculus of wintering men and animals on the high plains. Stranded in town by the blizzard, he heard the whispers about the Latvian's strange house that stayed warm on a whisper of fuel. A numbers man, he was skeptical, but intrigued. The day after the storm, he rode out with Crutchfield to see it for himself. Abernathy didn't care about the physics, but he understood the economics. He saw the small woodpile. He felt the even heat. He did a quick calculation in his head. The cost of the extra steel for the inner shell versus the savings on fuel, and the increased health and productivity of workers who weren't constantly fighting the cold. The math was undeniable. In his small leather-bound notebook, Abernathy sketched the design, a cross-section of the two nested Quonsets, with the dimensions and the crucial note, 14-inch sealed air cavity. That spring, his official report to the Union Pacific headquarters included a new section titled Recommendations for Winter Bunkhouse Construction. It detailed the double shell system, citing the verified fuel savings of over 70% and the complete elimination of interior frost and condensation. The railroad, always looking to cut operational costs, adopted the design for its remote section housing. By 1905, over a dozen Leapinch shells had appeared along the rail lines and on the larger ranches in Wyoming and Montana. The idea, born of Baltic memory and brutal experience, was now part of the landscape. The principle Arturs Leapinch deployed in 1903 is now so fundamental to building science that we take it for granted. The quiet space he built is the direct ancestor of the sealed gap in a modern double-pane window, the void often filled with an inert gas-like argon to further inhibit heat transfer. It is the same principle at work in the fiberglass bat insulation in your walls, which is effective not because of the glass fibers themselves, but because of the millions of tiny pockets of trapped air between them. From high-tech vacuum-insulated panels to the simple foam of a coffee cup, the lesson is the same. The most powerful barrier to the cold is often a carefully managed pocket of nothing. Arturs, with his smokehouse knowledge, had stumbled upon a universal truth of thermodynamics, a century ahead of its time. There is a lesson in the quiet space. The frontier taught a gospel of more, thicker walls, bigger fires, harder work. It was a philosophy of addition. Arturs Leapinch succeeded with a philosophy of subtraction. He didn't add more insulation, he added a void. He didn't fight the cold with a bigger fire. He starved it by removing its path into his home. He understood that the greatest strength, the most profound warmth, could be found not in the material itself, but in the intelligent and deliberate space between things. In a world that screamed for more, he listened to the quiet. He had learned from the biting Baltic winds and the vast Wyoming sky that the warmest wall was sometimes the space where no wind moved at all. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity as compelling as we did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It helps us to continue unearthing these forgotten histories. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever seen an old or unusual building technique that seemed to defy conventional wisdom? Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. While the techniques and scientific principles discussed are based on real historical practices, the specific characters, names, and sequence of events are fictionalized for narrative effect. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.